Today's program is the second part of the How to Share Your Library Story workshop in collaboration with HLA's Centennial Committee. Today's presentation will go over some of the basics of writing up library history, including suggestions for primary materials locally and nationally, suggestions for model studies, and basically how to think like a historian. Our speaker today is, of course, Andrew Wertheimer, Associate Professor of Library and Information Science at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, teaching the history of libraries and information, as well as other areas in library and archival studies. Andrew is co-chair of HLA's Centennial Committee and previously served for a decade as HLA's ALA chapter counselor. Dr. Wertheimer has a Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, in Library Information Science with a doctoral minor in Print Culture Studies, as well as an MLS from Indiana University. He is past chair of the ALA Library History Roundtable and the ALISE Information History Special Interest Group. Andrew has also served on the editorial boards of Libraries, Culture, History, and Society, Society Library History, and Library Quarterly. Along with Donald G. Davis Jr., he co-edited Library History Research in America, Essays Commemorating the 50th Anniversary of the ALA-LHRT. So Andrew, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate all of you for coming out during this really busy week. So yeah, as the intro said, you know, we're just going to try to get you a little bit further on the idea of being able to write your own history or history of your library, and hope that you'll be part of this kind of Centennial project that we're working on. And again, this is the second part of the last workshop was on oral history method. So this is going to kind of build on hopefully the idea of you might have done some oral history, or you might be kind of interested in doing some project. And this is kind of like, again, how do you work with this kind of data? And I know that some of you have history degrees. And so some of the things I'm going to be saying are really oversimplifications. And some of you are, you know, we're not a history program, so you know you're just starting out, and so I don't want to cause some anxiety. So I hope that some of you will be, you know, at least this brings you some different ideas, and that we can have a little bit of time for discussion. But again, the main goal for this is to come out with a anniversary. One way of celebrating our anniversary will be an OER work with different chapters of people exploring different aspects of our history, so whether it's of libraries, of reading, print culture, because there really isn't that much that's been written about school library media centers and about all of these aspects. So with that said today, so just going to talk a little bit about what is history. And again, you know, this is, so you could have taken a whole PhD, and you know, so the idea that I'm going to be able to simplify this into 1 hour, forgive me, it's going to be, you know, a really quick course, and just introduce a little bit of the world of library history and how it evolved, some of the key journals and the associations, so that you can try to read more about these, and also you know, hope that you'll be reading some of the works in order to help you with your writing, because the more that you read, the better the writer, the better the researcher that you'll be. So in addition, I'm going to try to look at some of the guidelines from the ALA Library History Roundtable, and some of their advice for doing historical research, talk about primary, secondary research, and then have some time ideally to talk story and have questions. So but for first, you know, start out, you know, the $1 million question: what is history? Why we should study it? Again, like a 1-minute introduction. So you could take a whole course on historiography, and that's like the research methods for doing history. And so again, really simplified, historians try to look for primary sources, so original, authentic evidence from that time period, and we try to triangulate it, you know, so because we know that, you know, that it's not just during COVID fog memory, you know, if something that we thought took place that time, our memory, or even what we write, or what a politician says at a conference, or what a general says, or everyone has different perspectives and memory recalls. And so we try to balance different types of materials in order to find the truth. And of course, postmodernists are going to say, what is truth? It's nothing but a construct. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But it's not only, finding original authentic sources, we also build on a huge amount of secondary research. So that's, basically the general knowledge in the state of things. So if I was looking at library history, I would need to look at the history of, library history in Hawaii. We would need to look at history of Hawaii, history of education in Hawaii, history of, anyway, all of these different areas, as well as local history, Kanaka Maoli history. All of these things are going to be important context. And so when we read something in primary research and we see that this person did this, well, they don't do it in a vacuum. So we look at all of that in context. And historians spend a lot of time focusing in their own research on periodization. So a lot of people, when they try to do something, they think, I'm going to do the whole history of my library or this press or something like that. But of course, you easily get overwhelmed and you lose all of the details. And so you try to think about what is a manageable chunk of something when the social context and we have enough primary resources to be able to say something that's really intelligent. And so getting that time period, so that's why almost all history, not all, but many history articles have, 1942 to 1944 or some time period at the end of their study saying, yes, I know this is within the context, but I'm trying to look at just that aspect. So again, why should we do history? So I love talking heads, and so it's like this, I forget what the name of the song is, but how did I get here? So this is really key, especially for libraries and archives. There's no constitutional mandate saying you must have libraries and archives. So how did we evolve? We are social constructs, and built on by law, by volunteer organizations creating models that became. So in order to understand all of the good things and the bad things, it helps us to do that. And, for those of you who think, I just want to be practical, I want to know how to do, I check in my books, I check out my books. It helps us to think bigger picture. So we sometimes in library land, I think we, the story about like getting like lemmings, there's one new trend in library land. I remember I had a colleague who spent a lot of her research on Second Life and thought that was the future. All reference desks are going to be virtual interactions in Second Life, and spent time learning how to dance in Second Life. A lot of people followed that, and it wasn't a waste, because you learn about AI, you learn about different types of yeah, that was Dr. Nall. And so wonderful contribution, but my point, and it's not just, I'm just using this as a random example, all of us, myself included, have followed different types of things that seemed like trends, because it's really easy not to think of the big picture. And of course, it's not only history that does that. Dr. Sato and I actually did an oral history interview with a bunch of Nisei who were at the University of Nebraska, and many of them were like geological engineers. So, and they think like ice ages, and they think, like huge. So it was interesting to see the different ways of how we think about time. And so when they talked about things like global warming, that was a really different kind of scale, because they were not just looking at day-to-day issues, but trends over glacial periods of time. So anyway, again, it helps us to think about what things that we've done that are maybe traditions are things that we could revise or even stop doing, or help us to reinvent, and basically ask ourselves, why do we do things? Again, we don't have a lot of philosophers in librarianship, and I think that they're sometimes valuable because, rather than just a how to do it guide, they help us to ask all of these things. And it's really extremely relevant during times of social change like we're in now. And in a similar kind of way, history, when done well, helps us to see our blind spots. Again, like one of my former advisor, Wayne Wiggin, talks about that librarianship is like tunnel vision. We think everything is the same way, and it's like when you drive to Kailua, you better look straight ahead and just make sure that you stay in your lane, but you don't see problems that might be far ahead. So another reason, and this is probably the reason that people have done library history from the beginning, is to celebrate the achievements of our pioneers, to honor anniversaries. And another reason is to basically become more reflective practitioners. So that's kind of all of these things beyond. And so on PBS NewsHour not too long ago, there was this professor was talking about history of, I think it was McDonald's. And she had looking at issues of race, and had a great point. They said that history is your greatest tool in problem solving. Once you understand why something has happened, why things have evolved, you can try to figure out how can you redress historical wrongs. How can you, a lot of things were chance, but after a while became maybe systemic racism, or became, so again, think, why do we have branches where we do, and why do we not have branches where we don't? So these kinds of questions are really helpful. So yeah, so the alligator or crocodile is like kind of my interior. You'll see a little bit of that. So I always feel like we need to contextualize things about history. So even in a talk of history, I'm not trying to get too much meta, or the crocodile isn't, but really briefly, just to understand library history, like it actually was one of the earliest sciences, that were when they tried to create a graduate school of library science at the University of Chicago. So this Pierce Butler came out with the first textbook of Introduction to Library Science, and history was one of the 4 kind of like founding sciences of history. So, and so Butler, looked at his model for history. His own interest was history of printing, and particularly like a lot of European early printings. So you'll see that there's these kinds of biases. So like in the history of, again, looking at Europe, looking at the experience on the East Coast, and very much celebrating the pioneers. So for example, like when ALA had its, in 1976, we had our Centennial. There were a lot of projects that came out with like this Dictionary of American Library Biography. And the cover is really telling, so that, we see maybe 3 women on the cover. They weren't the primary focus of a lot of the early histories. It was more of, who became elites, who did some of these people at that time see as models. And again, it was largely WASP men celebrating themselves. And actually a lot of those histories were written by WASP men. So even though, luckily we've had some change. So there's this great work, for example, by Suzanne Hildenbrand, reclaiming the American library past, writing the women in. She and Phyllis Dane, Christine Jenkins, and a lot of other pioneers have basically said, well, actually the majority of people in our field were women, including a lot of leaders. And so we've seen now several different waves of feminist research within library history or library history, also talking about need to embrace histories of people of color who were librarians and library leaders, as well as LGBTQIA+. So, which is really interesting because our field actually was one of the first to have a queer section within our professional organization. So anyway, lots of interesting things to investigate. And again, in this kind of microhistory, a lot of it came in the 60s and 70s. It kind of developed to sort of it's called a famous Dane-Harris debate. Michael Harris took Gramscian theory, like here we have like the panopticon, Harris drew from the writings of Italian theorist Gramsci, like the prison notebooks, and applied it from education history to go and say that a lot of our cultural institutions, such as schools, and then Harris tried to make the case also for libraries, were agents of social control. And we have this kind of image of libraries being only good, positive agents. And Harris tried to look at the history of Boston Public Library and said, well, these were elites who were worried about Irish immigrants who were coming to Boston, and they wanted to create different ways of how to control them and make them into future Protestant sort of like work ethic. Anyway, they with all of their social problems. So social within their social construct, obviously. So this was really debated by Phyllis Stein, who did her research on New York Public Library and said, really cherry picking evidence, and not all libraries are that way, and you have to look at more or organic, different types of sources. And so this was not really resolved, but it raised a lot of important questions in terms of library history. So I would say that kind of summarizing this, I would say that our field is much more exciting because it's more interdisciplinary with print culture history that I'll talk about, that's brought in other fields from architecture history, gender, sexuality, certainly a lot more about ethnicity and race, especially within the last 5 and 10 years. But one problem is that it's not part of the core in almost any LIS or I school, and there are very few researchers. And because of this, there's a lot of pukas, including there's very little written about Asian Americans, Kanaka Maoli, Native people, Latino, Latina, or again, different areas that there's so little. And Hawaii is part of this context. And so and it's been part of my research agenda, but it takes a long time to be able to learn, to be able to understand. I think to do this with some responsibility and I think humility. So it is slow going. And I understand that a lot of us, when we get to the centennial mark or the book publication, my idea is that this might be a first edition, and hopefully we'll continue to advance this because it's going to take a long time to do really well. But the good news is that there are organs and audiences for your research. So it's not just like talking in a vacuum. So there's the ALA Library History Roundtable. This is a few years ago. Diversity isn't necessarily the most, you can get an idea for that. It was established in 1947. There are panels every annual conference. And every 5 years, we have something called the Library History Seminar. Their website has a great bibliography that I'll talk about. So anyway, it's good to know. They also are the sponsors with the University of Pennsylvania Press of the, we'll talk about the journal in a second, but before that, they do give some awards for library history research. So for articles, for dissertation, for a published book, for a journal article. So really good places to know. They're also the sponsor with the, I want to say Penn State University, yes, Penn State University Press of Libraries, Culture, History, and Society. We're still a relatively young journal. We used to have a different journal that later kind of morphed into information and culture. But this is primarily focused on the role of libraries. So this information and culture, which is the journal that originally was the LHRT journal, but became so much like history of information technology and information that, one of the people who was on the kind of like this wasn't that thrilled about libraries. So that's why we created our own journal. In the UK, there's Library and Information History, and SHARP, which is a Society for History of Author Reading and Publishing, which I'll talk about in a second, has their own journal called Book History. And Library Quarterly, which is, I think, the most prestigious journal in our field, has articles on history, since its founding. And the IFLA's journal Libri also, it takes a number of articles. And international journals are really interested. I mentioned on the last note the the journal from the Japan Association for Library Information History. But if you're interested in something like, for example, Korean Americans, you know, there are journals that are going to be interested in especially transnational aspects. So it's a really exciting time. There are audiences for it. And then historians, our dream is to have time to write books. So, you know, that's where you can go and fit in the context and a lot of the primary details. So yeah, we look for monographs. So University of Massachusetts Press has a wonderful print culture history series. University of Wisconsin Press, the same. McFarland also has, they're probably a little bit more readable, but, you know, histories of the bookmobile, histories of these kinds of things. And Greenwood Press from the very early, published a number of really scholarly works, doing less in the history of libraries. And Scarecrow Press, which was founded by the founder of our LIS school at UH, also published a number of, especially dissertations dealing with library history. So, and I mentioned, so again, I'm sorry to kind of zip through it, but one of the reasons when you start to look at your history of your library, I encourage you to look at the angle of print culture history. So it's, Robert Darnton is one of the founders of the field, developed this idea of the print culture circuit. So we have like the author writes something, who then sends it to the publisher, who then sends it to a printer, and all of the different aspects that are involved, you know, including the inks, the paper, talking about, you know, workers and all of these areas, shippers, agents, smugglers, which becomes a really interesting part of some, so like he wrote, his focus was on books that were published in the Francophone diaspora that were smuggled into France, and later he asked the question, did these cause the French Revolution? So again, this print culture circuit also then looks at booksellers and then readers. So, and I think if I was redrawing the print culture circuit, I would have a unique box for libraries, but he puts them with readers as purchasers, borrowers, book clubs, binders, and points out that within all of this takes place within this economic and social sphere. What were the intellectual spheres, political, legal sanctions such as censorship, and saying that again, that this is a circuit that keeps influencing each other. So, and reflecting this new perspective, relatively new perspective, is this, I mentioned, other association called SHARP, which is interdisciplinary, and they have their own awards for research, a few small grants, a conference, and it's a really, really interesting, exciting area, because you have people coming. They're not just like historians within library and information science or librarians. They're not just people who are writing history of journalism or people who are doing history of publishing. It's a whole range of all of these people, so who come together. So, and again, so why, I think I talked about this to some extent, but it's really good for us to be engaged in writing history of archives or libraries, because it raises our own understanding. It helps us to think about the past and the future in a more critical way. And if you happen to be an academic librarian, you can use that for your research and get tenure and promotion. But more than that, I think it really, like I said, it makes us more reflective practitioners. It also helps us, we have archive land and library land, historians are some of our biggest users. So by doing our own projects, same as with doing genealogy or any type of work, it helps us to see how well does our system meet our own information needs. And also, again, we'll have more respect from our colleagues on those areas. So, okay, it's already, time is going so fast. So let's talk about some of the practical elements about crafting our own work. So one of the biggest things is like, how do you choose your topic? So I tried to give some examples of when you think about, to me, the title is one of the most important areas, and that's actually kind of like your outline or thinking about what are you trying to focus on. So if, for example, if you wanted to study one of my former colleagues, Dr. Sarah K. Van, the Southern Cataloger, her nurtured librarianship in Hawaii. Well, there were, for example, so if you're doing her, there's so many different aspects that you could look at. So she was a librarian, educator in Indonesia. She had talked with Melville Dewey's grandson. She wrote a biography of Dewey, which was not critical and didn't talk about the sexual harassment things. Why did she not write about those things? So what I'm saying is, if you want to do a biography, think about some angle, not just I'm going to cover everything about. You should find something that's going to fuel your work. So if you're looking at an institution, we could look at, for example, Sinclair Library. Since we seem to be going a major transition, what was once our research library, then undergraduate library, and now kind of the victim of its own success is becoming kind of an information commons, would be an interesting model. And so that, again, as a historian, we're thinking about periodization. And maybe for your first study, you might want to only look at like the final years of Sinclair, or only look at the AV collection, the Wong Center. Or again, when Ralph Shaw was brought to Hawaii, part of the thing was changing Sinclair from Dewey Decimal Classification to LC. What were the factors? Why did they do that? So when you have something like that, then you have to go and see, is there evidence? What did that reflect people's thinking at the time? You could look at Alulike, and for example, like if you want to look at Alulike, I would see like there are several different periods of when they had an important role. One would be like at the founding, or when they had grants for Kanaka students. Other would be like with the Ulukau, or another thing would be on their own libraries and the success and failures, or the funding and the role of grants. So you could look at an organization such as HLA or Hassel. So you could also do another type of project. So if you had a theme, so I wrote, like, for example, like libraries for whom, founding pioneers of librarianship in Hawaii. So if I was to look at several biographies and then try to find out, well, where were they educated? What were, how were they able to embrace the host culture or local cultures, and how could you try to find out that kind of work? Or another kind of project could be just simply a literature review. What has been printed, so that other people can try to advance their research. So the biggest challenge, once you have an idea of something you might be interested in, what kind of evidence are you going to have? So for primary materials, so archive collection, so BYUH has some records from the Library Association. The state archives has some unprocessed materials on the early days of HSPLS, or actually when it was the Library of Hawaii. But there are a lot of gaps. So it seems like, our climate doesn't do well, and a lot of librarians, unfortunately, are really bad about keeping their own records and think that they don't have value, and they put them in somewhere where there's not climate control. And, so actually I've had a lot of difficulty in finding a lot of materials like on history of HSPLS. So at some places you can find things in vertical files. Newsletters will say a lot of materials or reports. Of course, human subjects like oral history that we talked about last time, or you can do just simply informal kinds of interviews with people to go and find out information. Of course, there's a dream that you will have as diaries or letters, but that's oftentimes not possible. So media sometimes can fall, like especially newspapers can fall between primary or secondary, depending on what they were. But here in Hawaii, we have a wealth of newspapers, not only in English. Some of them are digitized, some are only on microfilm, and there are others where we have pukas. But then the range that you need to try to provide that context is within the secondary material. So that help the more secondary research that you do, the better that you'll be able to come up with the questions. So, and whenever I talk about this, doing history, I give the example of doing history is kind of like using a zoom lens. So as you can see, the zoom lens gets wider or narrower focus. And as you have more of an evidence or context, you can get, really fine time period. But you also have to think about, does that say something that's important? Does that help you to understand, does the closing of Sinclair a reflection of social trends, or is it simply local politics or power struggles? How can you connect it to some other sort of wide theme? So I've talked to some people who said, like, why did they write this? They said, well, nobody had written on it before. Well, it doesn't mean that anybody cares. So you want to try to aim for something that's going to have some sort of meaning. So, and the more that you can tie it within some sort of other wider scholarly discussion, the more likely the work is to be cited, and more likely it's going to influence others. So, okay, give really quick examples. So like, let's say that I wanted to look at a Native Hawaiian book collector. I would think about some questions like, for an individual, what did the person read or collect? Why did they do it? Who mentored the collector? What was the impact on author, publishers, or booksellers? Did anyone else use their collection, or what was their impact? Did the books or manuscripts go to a library? How were they used there? Did the collector make notes or do any annotations? Or actually, there's a whole history of like people focusing on book plates and provenance. Or how did the collector use the collection? And again, remember that sometimes if there's something that you don't have, like you can't find, like let's say it was sold, or that also would be something that you could try to think critically at. So, but again, when you're doing these things, don't only focus on the individual. You should look at the secondary literature on book collecting, look at other specialized book collectors who are indigenous or BIPOC collectors. There's a kind of beginning literature on that. I would look at the history of Hawaiian literature, history of the Renaissance, looking at history of local publishing, of course, looking at Native Hawaiian history, history of libraries, book publishing, and then, wider themes about cultural sustainability, language suppression, laws, resistance, all of these other kinds of things. So another example, if I was to look at Manoa Public Library, who are the users? Are some of them famous? How are they impacted? When was the library established? Who were the employees who worked there? Who were on the Friends of the Library? What were some of the unique collections, or how were they used? Or, a really probably an easy finite article would be on the campaign to go and remodel the library, and you have the echo charrette and how, it's like a more than 20-year history. There's also like the art history or kind of aspect of the mural. But again, I would try to be engaging with history of Manoa, history of Honolulu, how the diversity there, history of the public library system, history of branch libraries in the United States. Of course, there's history of state politics is going to be really important, since you had the certain legislators, what was their role? Some of them were big power brokers on the Dream Team. So what is the history of the Democratic Party here? And then again, the question of like sustainable librarianship, since it received LEED certification. So again, if I was taking that study, I would think about, most typical kind of student papers, someone would say, I'm doing the whole history of the branch. But as I'm saying, I would try to find some way of cutting that period into this kind of periodization, and think about how can we make something that's significant. Maybe the founding, maybe the renovation, and maybe you first do the first paper on this, and then you try to keep reforming as you discover more things. So in the old way, like when I studied literature as an undergraduate, they often said to go and look for conflict, and they had like 5 types of conflict. My students like to point out that that's not how we teach English in postmodern days. But in any case, historians also will find that when there's power conflict, that's oftentimes where you're going to find a really interesting drama that's going to tell you about this. So again, I have a title, Political Power of an Elite Neighborhood, Engage Librarianship in a Campaign for a New Mānoa Public Library, 1990 to 2012. It's finite. It's something I could try to, engage with the literature and people from the subtitle or from the title and the subtitle, you can see that there are issues of like civic education, engagement. And again, you can do this with any archive, any academic library, special library, school library, media center, again, so it's just tying it within the larger context. So yeah, I'm going to go through really quickly. You can look this up on the ALA website, but they published quite a few years ago guidelines for writing library history in 11 easy steps. So again, identify the main primary sources that you can find, and I'll show you the appendix. Also identify local histories of collections that will help, that might be models or context. The more library histories that you can find, again, will be models in terms of the writing and the research questions. And then find sources that are going to give you a sense of this development and this context, particularly within that time period. So again, that's why periodization, is so key. So if something happened in the 70s and we're talking about funding under, Great America, and, is it going to be different in the Reagan administration when we see taxes and budget cuts? So that's what I'm saying, context matters. So obviously this should be a given for us. So immerse yourself in local source materials. And I'm not going to try to deconstruct what local means here, but the more sources that you can go to. Obviously, if we were to add this in Hawaii, we'd probably say also host culture. So step 6 is to create a chronology of critical events and people in the history of your library. And this is going to help you to establish that periodization, again, that sort of time periods. And if you're doing a larger work, like a thesis or a book, those periods can also help you to write chapters. Or if you think this might be 1 or 2 off, that'll help you to think about something that others can try to investigate. And then, again, present drafts of what you know, the more footnotes that you have. Back when I was in school, although there were a lot of, still, we all use computers, but historians really believed in note cards. And the idea was that helped you to try to think about, well, what were the sources? How can you arrange things? Okay, I'm certainly not going to go and force anybody to do that. But again, really focus on the sources, primary and secondary works. So step 10 is to publish your work. But I would actually say that beyond that, that's a matter of simply getting it to wider fields. So that could also include presenting it at conferences where you can get critical feedback before it goes into or is considered for a journal. So do we have one? Okay, I'm forgetting. So how many steps? But in any case, the appendix lists the different types of source material that you could find. So obviously board minutes are ideal. Annual reports, departmental reports, even collection management statements or policies. All of you who remember 615 or your collection management class, yay. So that should tell you about what are the things that they collect, what are the things that they don't collect. Again, whenever you read any of these kind of evidence, you have to read it with a kind of critical eye and think about what are the things that are these blind spots. Again, the dream is correspondence, or in the old days, they used to call them letter books. So we'd be happy with vertical files or even, so photographs are something that are great to be able to read, look into details. And of course, local media have a lot of material. And again, dream personal papers of librarians or support staff. And they are not only in archives. Like when I did my dissertation, I contacted a number of people who either lived or worked in the concentration camps where Japanese Americans were detained. Some of them had their own scrapbooks or memoirs. That was really extremely helpful. So, and I collected that as part of doing oral history research. So, and again, it doesn't only need to be with the librarians, but get the users' viewpoints or non-users' viewpoints. And again, that you should look that with other published works. So don't forget to look at other possible precursor organizations, published biographies, memoirs, bibliographies, actually a secondary source, but in any case, student papers, obviously like theses. So the Hawaii and Pacific collection has quite a few blueprints, and architecture materials can also do that. So again, looking in Hawaii, so suggest looking at your state library, other institution archives. Unfortunately, like HSBLIS doesn't have their own records management center that's open to the public. They don't, so it should be at the state archives, but they have very little material. So, you know, see what's at the Hawaiian Historical Society, what's in branch library vertical files or in your school. Again, like I said, I already mentioned the HLA collection, the BYUH archives, other things that are at the Hawaii and Pacific collection and UHM's Hawaii Pacific collection. So when you're trying to find these kind of secondary works, so to look for model stories that can give you an example, Don Davis and Mark Tucker created this, it's from 1989. And if you Google this American Library History, or I can share the link in the chat later. That's actually been digitized and, or scanned, and part of it's online, so you can do a keyword search. But it's not just a bibliography. They read the different chapters. They read all of the works that were published until that time, and each of the chapters begin with some kind of literature review, saying, like, for example, in the history of school libraries, there hasn't been that much, but these were some of the most important works. Again, it's also kind of dated, but Art Young had a collection with annotations of dissertations and theses that were about the history of libraries. And ALA has, since the I believe it's, since 1980, Ed Gedekin from Iowa State University has been compiling a bibliography of works on library history, and every 2 years in their journal they would have a published lit review. So you can go through that. Some of them are searchable. Again, this is just through the ALA. You may recognize that's the old logo of that. I used our photo from, this is when I was chair of LHRT. That's a photo of HSL, right? So if you're interested, I also co-edited a volume when the Library History Roundtable celebrated its 50th anniversary, which has a lot of really good articles to give you context, such as I mentioned, like Suzanne Hildenbrand, who talked about librarians' history. So she has an article on library feminism. Mary Niles Mack looking at multicultural literature. Cheryl Knott Malone was looking at desegregation in a lot of libraries in the South. Jim Carmichael looking at LGBTQIA+. Anyway, so again, whole number of different aspects will give you a great context. So I've already said this, so just keep thinking about who your audience is, and why it's really important. And again, just really library studies, history is different from a lot of other social sciences that, you're oftentimes in a social science thing, I'm going to prove this before you do your study, and you gather the evidence and you see whether your theory passed or not. So an analysis in LIS is we have to go and look at the sources first before we try to draw our own conclusions. So but how you analyze your findings is going to be your key. And so we have so many different types of lenses available. So traditional things that historians have done, from sociology and history, you could look at class, the Marxist historical aspects, psychology of history, sociological elements. And then since the development of postmodernism, we have much more on gender, sexual identity, ethnicity, race, post-colonial, indigenous areas. And I think that this the advantages and disadvantages of the kind of postmodern or critical research, but especially for us in Hawaii, it's really required because it helps us to unpack a lot of things that weren't spoken. such as how much of our history has been kind of covered up by idea of aloha spirit, and that, there are no issues of conflict, of power, of class. So I think that's really important for us to do here. There's some great models of people who've done theoretical work, such as Christine Pauli, is an Oxford educated. She's retired, but she wrote these great works like this history of her, came out of her dissertation, Reading on the Middle Border. It's about reading in a small city in Iowa. You might think, well, who cares? But she looks at, actually, she matches census records and individual circ records and is able to go and look at, well, this young Catholic boy checked out these books. Some of them were girls' stories as how literature had seen it at the time. Why was he doing it? Was it for his sister? Was it because we might have two fixed ideas of what is gendered reading? Anyway, so all of these different kinds of aspects. What was the role of censorship in the area? But I should say that the majority, there's a lot of work in postmodernism that is, I would say, bad postmodernism. So some people say that a lot of postmodern work is like untranslated French, and that people get, so I try to use this example as like this, the camera that I'm holding in that picture is it a camera? Well, people could use it as a metaphor for a camera, but obviously it's not going to take pictures. It's not a lens. There's a famous work by Jacques Derrida called Mal d'Archives, the archive fever, and whereas he uses the archive as a metaphor much more than on talking about the archive itself. And so I think that's when you get too obsessed with metaphor and you're losing track of the real history. So my ideal of history is that you're informed by postmodern questions and deconstructing colonialism and these things, but write it in a way that's readable by people and that makes sense. So there's a work here that for example, there's a photo. This is anyway, I shouldn't deal with it since I don't have that much time. But anyway, I think that the librarian sometimes becomes a metaphor, and I'd encourage you to aim for what the library is real, because we want to be able to impact real libraries and archives. So again, there's a value of people who want to do secondary research in history, such as former colleague Dr. Knuth, who wrote on Libricide, did a lot of work, he's synthesizing other works and bringing in new questions. Unfortunately for our field, it's really difficult to try to do that because there isn't that much work that's available that you can try to recontextualize. So time is going really fast, so I'm going to skip over again. I mentioned last time Valerie Scheindlin's oral history thesis on Ruth Horry. I think it's a great work to look at if you're trying to find different types of models. But again, the idea is that we're going to try to come up with this OER text. And in addition, at the next conference, we have some time reserved for people to share their progress. So please let me know if you're interested in being part of that panel. And so with the rest of the time, I just like to kind of open it to talk story for us to share your ideas and think about, again, what are you interested in researching? What sources are you finding? Maybe you don't want to do something, but somebody else would be a good person to talk with, or a collection. Are there some challenges that we might be able to help you with? And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for a little bit of discussion. I forget, we're ending at 1?
Yes, Andrew, that's correct.
Okay, so there's only like 11 minutes, but I'd be happy. I'd love to hear your own, any of you who are doing your own work, some of your responses to these questions. If you can share things that you're working on. I know it's a tough time, to be working on doing history but I will stop talking. I'll also take questions.
Andrew, this is Gwen.
Hi, Gwen.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm thinking about actually contacting Sylvia Mitchell to do an oral history of the Librarians Association of Hawaii, but I'm a little concerned about being able to find documentary evidence about that body in it to supplement what I learned from her and her colleagues. So do you have any suggestions for me?
Well, first of all, I think that's a fantastic topic. And so I think, so for those of you who don't, that was like when Bart Kane was the librarian, and they tried, this is before I came here, but they tried to outsource the acquisition of, Baker and Taylor did the selection of materials. And a lot of librarians were upset that HLA didn't do more to oppose the Kane administration. And so they created their own association. So actually, I remember that Sylvia published some articles, like the letters to the editor in the paper, like for example, who was it that one of the city council members who was on fraud, was brought up on fraud charges. They wrote a letter to the editor supporting him. So I mean, there's a little bit of written materials, but I think that you could create the same kind of drama by also talking with who are the people in like Bart. Is Bart Kane still alive?
He might be.
He passed away.
Oh,
okay, well, okay. I don't recommend seances as a technique for doing oral history. So unless you have some connections and can triangulate it with non-seance methods. There are other people who probably were in administration at that time and might be able to give a story. There might be also hearings, such as the Board of Education. A lot of those have been, I imagine some of those people spoke publicly. Maybe not using that term, but I mean, there's no problem with focusing it on there. And then I would, in terms of the secondary literature, there's all of this work on the kind of the history of social responsibility movements, and Becky Knuth and co-wrote an article about the outsourcing scandal, and there are a few other articles that talked about that. I don't think that they focused on this librarian, the kind of that association. So I think this would be great. And there are a lot of, here in Hawaii, there are a lot of things that are not, that we're going to have a hard time finding that kind of written evidence. But as soon as you talk with Sylvia or others, I wouldn't be surprised if they might have saved their own kind of clipping materials. So like, for example, like one of my classes, archive projects, we worked with the Save Sandy Beach collection. This was, again, the kind of grassroots act. They had saved their own materials. And part of that's, it's really important to do that history while these folks are still alive and have things in their garage or wherever. So does
that's all very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's really exciting. And yeah, great project. And I think it's still really relevant today, right? So there's yeah, anyway. Yeah, thanks, Gwen. Others wanted to? So I should point out, not everything that you do needs to be something that is progress or love, but you try everything that you treat with respect, such as when this Association of Hawaii Librarians, I think it'd be really key for work for this collection, because it asks us, what is the role of the Hawaii Library Association ourselves, and did we succeed or fail? So like, again, I would try to find from BYUH, do we have minutes of HLA from that time, and like or in any of our publications at that era, how did they react to this kind of discussion? I would also ask, like, did they attend HLA before? Were they always kind of on the side and never kind of engaged? Or another question like I could look at is like, it would be a little bit more difficult, but if you were to find some like membership directories of HLA, when I joined HLA and moved here in 2003, very few public librarians were members of HLA, and compared to, especially who went to the conferences, they're much more academic, many more academic librarians. And I wonder how much of that was because of librarians, public librarians didn't feel represented by HLA in that case. So I really don't know. And maybe they were members and they just, because they weren't given time off or the salaries weren't commensurate, they weren't going to conferences. So that's when, again, you need to look at the primary materials.
I can see that I need to find a co-author.
I think that, so you have a history degree, you're excellent, but all of us, that's a good example that all of us benefit from talking story with each other. And so there, like when I first started to try to write history, I mean, there's a reason why I think, besides the flood, that my research isn't, like the most prolific. Part of it, it takes a long time to get to understand the kind of unwritten power dynamics, and a lot of these stories are not something that's going to be really evident from the archive. And in my case, I'm really coming at it as someone from the outside. So you've been here a long time, but again, all of us have, the more that we share stories, and so that's again the reason why it'll be really fun. We can still be a little bit more informal at our HLA panel, and it'll be great to go and hear responses from people, because that, again, when you bring it to the peeps, they will tell them, well, that was my impression, or I went to one of their meetings, or but we all benefit from each other's understanding and questions, and like the case, the questions that I gave Gwen, it's the same as like when I give questions to my students. I'll say, like, in order to get an A+, these are some of the, like, I might list like 10 questions. I say, could you answer one of them? It's not like, it's impossible to answer all of the things that one, again, especially when you have limits of sources. So don't feel pressure or anxiety when you're starting to do this kind of project, and it's, you're coming across some challenges, but that's why it'll be really good to just share what you have, and especially orally, before we try to try to get something in print. Like, they're only like three minutes. I know that people probably have a lot to do, but quick question or.
Hi, Dr. Wertheimer. This is Jessica.
Hi, Jessica.
Calling from, joining you from Wailuku Library. And I appreciate your presentation. I feel like I've been out of any kind of academic anything for so long that it's a little bit daunting. But and I don't know if I'm the right person to do this, but I did find this like treasure trove of primary source material here at Wailuku, and I'm glad I salvaged it, because I don't know what would have happened to it if I hadn't. But it has, librarian reports, annual reports from as back as 1959, with the territory of Hawaii heading, and another one that was written in 1965, written for HLA Journal. Wow, I didn't even see that. So I'm just merely passionate and fascinated by history. And I have somebody I want to interview as well, who has been in the system for over 30 years. So I'm not sure where to start with all this. I suppose I could start reading some of the things you were recommending, and because I have some preconceived notions of what I want it to be, but then I think I need to be more in the gathering information, and because it's amazing the way these reports were written, and they're like little time capsules of the way people thought then and wrote. And so anyhow, it's a little bit overwhelming, but I'm hoping I can contribute something or team up with someone.
So, well, so we're working on this as a team. I'm happy to talk with you about that. You might see if there's, I could, let me know if you want a student if you want a co-author or something, or another colleague.
Okay.
But, I give you, feel empowered. A lot of librarians don't have history degrees. They don't have, this kind of background, but the more, they have this kind of passion and questions. And so, read a book on the history of bookmobiles, look at some of the local history. And I think that some of those will help you to see what is unique about your story. And, that will be the thing that makes it work.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And thanks for saving the materials. That more librarians need to do that. So. And I should mention BYUH digitized the HLA journals / newsletter. So we all owe a great deal, and Gwen helped to make that possible. So that there are some resources like that, so that'll help us.
Okay, thank you so much. That concludes our program. Today's program is made possible through HLA members like yourself. Next month's next up program will be sent out to you shortly, and we're always looking for program ideas. So if Sharice can put her email in the chat box, we can welcome you to contact her if you have any great ideas for future programming. Again, mahalo and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.